Okay, hi guys. Let's get started. Alright, so I wanted to clarify some things about the readings. So I had sent you guys the announcement with the readings listed, but I think I forgot to tell you guys that some of the readings are in the additional readings folder, in the files folder. So let's just navigate that for a second. I'll show you guys where things are. Because some things are in the let me share my screen. Are in the Adorno folder, but some of them are not. Okay, so the Adorno folder that's listed Adorno 1 has Negative Dialectics that we will be reading from. And so let me download both of these. And the Adorno 2 folder on Canvas has the readings that we'll be doing on Thursday. And that's on subject and object, marginalia to theory and praxis, resignation, and late capitalism or industrial society. But the other short readings that we had for tonight, namely Why Still Philosophy, and reflections on class theory, and the imaginative excesses, those are all in the additional readings. So, and there's actually a couple of things that we'll just read aloud in class together, just to sort of establish some ideas, to help us navigate, to help us decipher Adorno. Since he's going to be making a lot of references, he'll make a lot of references to things that we have discussed in class, but he'll also be making references to things that we have not discussed in class. Okay, so I just wanted to clarify that. So we have for tonight the first section of our readings from Negative Dialectics, and tomorrow night we'll do our second selection of reading from Negative Dialectics. I think I mentioned that what I listed here, selections from the lectures on metaphysics, concepts, and problems. Those are really restatements of, they're in the lecture format of what he wrote in Negative Dialectics, so there's some redundancy there, as we'll see. Okay, so just to begin where we pick up where we left off last week, with Korsch's Marxism and Philosophy. We'll begin with just the beginning of Adorno's own book. So if you remember, for Korsch, he quoted Marx for philosophy to be abolished, it must be realized. Adorno is going to begin with his introduction, at least, with a very similar idea, picking up the same idea. The possibility of philosophy. So I mentioned last week with Korsch that it's a little bit peculiar, it's counterintuitive for us to think of philosophy itself as something that we need to think about as a symptom. Usually philosophy is just a way of thinking. It might be like a belief system, some kind of systematic thinking, or method of thinking, especially an analytical method. So to think about that itself as a symptom, and also we will see in the readings for tonight, to think of Marxism, Marxism's own method, Marxism's own procedure, its own way of doing things, the immanent dialectical critique of phenomena, as itself symptomatic of capitalism. Time-bound, historically, a phenomenon of the capitalist era specifically. So Adorno's following through on this idea that Korsch picked up from the early Marx, the early philosophical Marx, especially from the Theses on Feuerbach. Adorno writes, "Philosophy, which once seemed obsolete, lives on because the moment to realize it was missed. The summary judgment that it had merely interpreted the world, that resignation in the face of reality had crippled it in itself, becomes a defeatism of reason after the attempt to change the world miscarried." So that is the 11th thesis on Feuerbach. Here we can bring up the theses on Feuerbach. Look at the 11th thesis together, which is very short. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. So what Adorno is emphasizing is that if the attempt to change the world fails or was miscarried, then we're thrown back onto philosophy. So philosophy might have seemed obsolete to Marx, but we're thrown back on it because we're still in capitalism. So again, capitalism generates a need for philosophy. The question is how we understand that need for philosophy, because it is different from the need for philosophy in other historical epochs, the necessity of philosophy, or philosophy itself as a necessary form of appearance, as a necessary phenomenon in a specific historical moment, might be different in capitalism than it had been previously. I think that when we read Hegel's philosophy of history, the idea that the ideas that people have of their own time might be an alienated expression or might exhibit a self-contradiction with the reality of their time is itself part of the reality of the time. Meaning if the actuality of the reality of the time is that there's a need for change, if the actual substance, if the truth of a time is the necessity of change, then the fact that the ideas will seem to be in contradiction with the reality is itself significant and meaningful. It doesn't mean that the ideas are meaningless. It means that they're meaningful in their contradiction with reality. Okay, and keep in mind what we're talking about here. We're talking about the contradiction of capitalism, the contradiction between bourgeois social relations and the ideological superstructure of those social relations, the consciousness of those social relations, consciousness not only in theory but in practice, so consciousness as a lived practical reality, contradicted by the industrial forces of production, which means that the socioeconomic base is in contradiction with the ideological superstructure. The social being is in contradiction with the consciousness. The historical conditions are in contradiction with the theory and practice of the time. Another way of thinking about this, we haven't really used this language very much, but we're going to have to start using it. We had it a bit already introduced, is non-identity. This is one of Adorno's favorite phrases, non-identity. The non-identity of a historical moment with itself, so a non-self-identity. So social being and consciousness are non-identical, and that's because the historical conditions are not self-identical in capitalism. Okay, so philosophy exists as a function of that. And really what we're talking about is philosophy living on after Kant and Hegel. So there's another wrinkle here, which is to say that traditional philosophy had already been rendered obsolete, had already died, had already been superseded by what Korsch called revolutionary philosophy in the late 1700s, in the late 18th century. Starting in Rousseau, although with predecessors, all sorts of predecessors. John Locke, David Hume, René Descartes, Benedict Spinoza, and others. There are many kind of roots to the Enlightenment that reached a certain kind of crescendo in the 1700s with Rousseau. The traditional philosophy had been overthrown. It had been rendered manifestly obsolete in reality. It had been overthrown. So the Enlightenment philosophes, the French Enlightenment of the 1700s, why did they call themselves philosophes? Lovers of wisdom, lovers of thinking, contra philosophie. So they were philosophes contra philosophie, because philosophy was a system of thinking that to them still reminded them too much of religion, theology, and with traditional metaphysics. If you remember, Adam Smith said, universities teach useless theology and metaphysics. Kant said, hold on. Maybe metaphysics are not useless, maybe they're useful, but only in a critical sense, no longer in the traditional sense, in the affirmative sense. The metaphysics that ratifies or affirms in thought our social reality as a practical as well as theoretical reality. What if that kind of metaphysics is obsolete, we've overthrown it, but we still need metaphysics because we need a critical metaphysics. And by critical metaphysics, we need to be able to have categories with which to reflect critically on our own faculties, on our own subjective faculties, because we're tasked with changing the world and changing ourselves through the use of these faculties. So there was a need for philosophy in a new way, not in the old traditional way, in a new way. Korsch called that revolutionary philosophy, but that was the philosophy of the bourgeois revolution. That was the philosophy that was necessary, that was needed for the task of the bourgeois revolution. Hegel said, wisdom comes after the fact, post festum. It's an ex post facto phenomenon. The owl of Minerva, the owl of wisdom, flies at dusk after the feast, after it had happened. And so bourgeois society only becomes conscious of itself at the end. Revolutionary philosophy is only achieved at the end of the bourgeois revolution. So the bourgeois revolution started in the Renaissance, then it ended with the American and French revolutions at the end of the 1700s. And therefore became conscious of itself. And then philosophy was supposed to, as Korsch put it, live on in everyday life. He tied that specifically to Hegel, meaning where we started with Marx, when Marx said philosophy had become worldly because the world had become philosophical, meaning philosophy had dissolved itself into the world because the world had become philosophical. The way Hegel puts it is that we live in a more abstract and therefore a world, a society, a social reality, social relations that are mediated not by direct moral precepts and not by immediately recognizable aesthetic appearances, but rather mediated by more abstract concepts. So we live in a more abstract society practically, and therefore our consciousness of the society is more abstract than it was in religion, where it had an aesthetic and then practically moral appearance. Okay, so we need this new critical philosophy to recognize this radical change that had come about, this revolution that had come about, the bourgeois revolution, the overthrow of traditional civilization, and the emergence of bourgeois social relations of labor as opposed to the traditional social relations of religion, also shadowed by a kind of proto-enlightenment, namely philosophy per se, metaphysics, which had transcended religion, no longer thought of itself as theology, but thought of itself as addressing the physical laws of the universe. That's still metaphysics. Because there are no physical laws of the universe, there are only logics of our own subjective practices and self-understandings. There are no rules to the universe in itself. There are only rules to the way we relate to the universe, and therefore the way we understand the universe. That's why we're constantly revising science. We're constantly revising the physical laws of the universe, because in fact, those reflect not the universe, but reflect our understanding of the universe, and we will never stop revising them. Right, so the physical laws of the universe are not laws of the universe or of things in themselves, but only laws of our practical and theoretical relation to things and to the universe. This is modern philosophy. Right? It sounds like relativism as opposed to absolutism, and in that respect, that's true because it's changeable. Again, the point is not to interpret the world, but to change it. But that was already understood by Kant and Hegel, so what is Marx adding to that? Not much. Remember that Lukács said, okay, the perspective is the same. Bourgeois, proletarian, the perspective is the same, only the position is different, meaning the understanding is the same, except you understand it either positively or negatively. You either understand it as emancipation and the achievement of freedom, or you understand it as a new kind of unfreedom. Or maybe a new kind of unfreedom we will see in the reading today that seems like an old kind of unfreedom. We'll see what Adorno has to say about that in the Reflections on Class Theory. So philosophy, what do we need philosophy for? Well, in one sense we don't, in another sense we do. Namely, capitalism produces yet again another new kind of need for philosophy. Philosophy as opposed to Marxism. So if it's not going to be revolutionary philosophy, in the same tradition with Kant and Hegel that Marx was part of, according to Korsch, then what will it be? Well, it will be a kind of recrudescence. It will be a kind of return to traditional philosophy, to traditional metaphysics, including at the sort of outer limits of that with existentialism. And I'd mentioned last week, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche stand as these examples of philosophy of the 19th century, roughly contemporaneous with Marx. Kierkegaard contemporaneous more with the early Marx, Nietzsche more contemporaneous with the late Marx, and then after Marx, more contemporaneous with Marxism. But they don't seem like philosophy anymore. Indeed, they seem like the birth of what's known as anti-philosophy. So not merely anti-metaphysics, the way David Hume was anti-metaphysics and other Enlightenment philosophers were anti-metaphysics, but anti-philosophy. So why is that? Why are Kierkegaard and Nietzsche seemingly the birth of anti-philosophy? Because they're geared to the rejection, or at least the wrestling with, but really a kind of agonism with Hegel. So as anti-philosophies, they're really anti-Hegel. And the question is Marx that too? Or is Marx something else? Is Marx not an anti-philosophy, but really something else? And that's the question of critical theory. So finally, after all that long preamble, I want to say something about Adorno. Since there's capital C, capital T critical theory, there's small c, small t critical theory, but that would be, as Robert Pippin said in his short piece on the first day of class we had, but that category, small c, small t critical theory, is so wide as to encompass Heidegger and his influential army of epigones, namely the French fries, I like to call them, French postmodernism. Lacan, in some respect, he's a psychoanalyst, but influenced by a kind of Heideggerianized reading of Hegel via Kojève and others. Louis Althusser, who's a kind of a dissident Marxist, who's influenced by Lacan, as well as by Heidegger and pre-Socratic ancient Greek philosophy. Foucault, Michel Foucault. Derrida, Jacques Derrida, and Gilles Deleuze. So Deleuze. So these are the French small t critical theorists who are influenced by Heidegger and who are also born in a crucible. They're contemporaries of Adorno, a little bit younger, but basically contemporaries of Adorno, who are really rejecting Hegel and rejecting Marx insofar as Marx is Hegelian. So it's very important. Althusser, for instance, is very much geared in an anti-Hegelian way against Lukács, against Georg Lukács, less aware of Korsch, and is sort of finding in Marxism a problem, a liability, namely the Hegelianism, which still seems too bourgeois. So there's a kind of, and that's in the context of the French Communist Party, also in the context of the Sino-Soviet split. So Althusser is influenced by Mao in China, in his split from mainstream communism, dominated by the Soviet Union. So the communist parties in the world allied with the Soviet Union, Mao departs from them, and that's why we have Maoism. And Althusser is influenced by that, and then tries to sort of philosophically understand it. But usually in terms of what would appear to be an anti-philosophy, and trying to bring Marx into that anti-philosophy position. Now, interestingly, this has to do with scientific socialism. So this is the language that we're going to have. Scientific socialism. So there is this question of scientific socialism, because Marxism defined itself as scientific. We talked about that last week, that it's a Wissenschaft. It's a science in that sense, meaning a form of knowledge aware of its own conditions of possibility. So scientific philosophy, that's what Kant and Hegel called their philosophy, their critical philosophy, and their speculative philosophy, their dialectical philosophy, they considered to be scientific because it was aware of its own conditions of possibility, its own societal and historical, its practical conditions of possibility, different from how we connotate science to mean the physical sciences. No, there are other sciences. There are social sciences, there are human sciences, the humanities, there's Wissenschaft. And so scientific philosophy is philosophy that's able to reflect on the very possibility of philosophy, as Adorno puts it here. The very possibility of philosophy. What's the condition of possibility of philosophy? What makes it possible? What makes it necessary? Rather than just launching into what are the metaphysical truths of the universe, but rather not taking that for granted at all, that we're even in that position to be able to ask that, but questioning the very possibility of philosophy. So science. Now I mentioned the pre-Socratics. Pre-Socratics are influential for Nietzsche. They're also influential for Heidegger. Heidegger is a Nietzschean. And the pre-Socratics, the people before Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, who establish at least Western philosophy, but really they establish a way of thinking that one sees in other traditional civilizations as well. So it's called the Axial Age, is the period when philosophy emerges from religious theology, metaphysics, religious metaphysics or theology. The Axial Age, the birth of science, as well as the birth of philosophy. So the birth of the physical sciences, as well as the birth of this new way of thinking about thinking, rather than trying to divine the will of God or the gods, or the will of the divine forces. Okay, so the pre-Socratics, it's difficult to figure out whether the pre-Socratics are they philosophers? It seems like they're the first philosophers. But they write in poems, they write in verse, and they're also doing science. They're doing physical experimentation and speculation. All right, so they're not only they're doing what we would now call empirical science, in terms of physical science, as well as doing logic. But it's presented in the form of poetry. So it's kind of art, philosophy, and science all wrapped up in one. And yet, we distinguish now, and people have distinguished indeed since classical antiquity, between art, philosophy, and science. So the pre-Socratics seem to be prior to and innocent of that division. And indeed, Nietzsche and Heidegger make a big deal about that. They problematize philosophy per se because of its distinction from science and from art. And they think that this is like a kind of, not merely a bifurcation, but a trifurcation of truth. Right? That these truths have become separated and alienated from each other. The truth of physical reality, the truth of our thinking, and the truth of our feeling, our aesthetic experience, have become divorced from each other. And that seemed to have had a very destructive set of consequences. Now, it's interesting that though that goes back thousands of years, that trifecta between, or trifurcation, I should say more accurately, between art, philosophy, and science, even though that existed for thousands of years, no one thought that it was this origin of horrible consequences until the 1800s, until capitalism, until the capitalist era. Now, I mentioned this last bit, especially incorporating art into it, because who is Adorno? So Adorno, I started with capital C, capital T critical theory as opposed to small c, small t critical theory. So he's a member of the Frankfurt School. That's where we get this term critical theory from. And the capital C, capital T critical theory, according to Robert Pippin, is a left Hegelian, Marxist, and Frankfurt School tradition. It is, certainly. But what does that mean? So sometimes that term is treated as a euphemism for Marxism because it was used that way by the Frankfurt School in exile when they left Nazi Germany and came to Britain and the United States for their survival. They called themselves critical theorists rather than Marxists as a kind of euphemism, as a kind of cover, because they were afraid of anti-Marxism, anti-communism in Britain and the United States. Not unrealistically were they afraid of these things. But also, in using the term critical theory, they actually used it before their exile. They used this term in order to underscore, to emphasize, to bring out a dimension of Marxism itself that they thought had been neglected. Especially when Marxism had become either a counter-revolutionary ideology with the Social Democrats and Socialists around the Russian Revolution, in opposing the Russian Revolution, or it had become an official state ideology in the Soviet Union, and then eventually expanding into the East Bloc. So it had become an ideology, and yet it was supposed to be ideology critique. It was supposed to be the critique of ideology. So how to rescue it from this ideologization of Marxism, or as Lukács treated it, the reification of Marxism, as Korsch called it, the vulgarization of Marxism. What to do about that? How to counterpose the Marxism that one wanted to preserve that was being lost through its vulgarization, its self-reification, and its ideologization. Or we will see, as Adorno also calls it, its dogmatization, so becoming a dogma, dogmatization. Well, you call it critical theory. In other words, you emphasize that aspect, that maybe Marxism's not a philosophy, but it's a critical theory, including a critical theory of philosophy. Right, so you could say with Kant and Hegel, critical philosophy is a philosophy of philosophy. It's a self-reflexive, it's a Wissenschaft, scientific philosophy, because it can philosophically explain philosophy itself in a way that Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle tried to, but didn't. Ultimately did fall back on metaphysics that was unaccounted for, that was unexplained. So Kant and Hegel explained what Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle could not explain, in fact. And bourgeois philosophy as a whole, starting with people like Descartes, but others, actually sought to do this. They sought to explain what the philosophers themselves could not explain about their own philosophy. So a philosophy of philosophy Well, still, there needs to be, yet again, a distinction between Marxism and Kant and Hegel. So there's continuity, but there's also change. So as continuity, we're still living in bourgeois society. We're still living in bourgeois emancipation relative to traditional civilization. But there's also a change, and that change is crucially important: capitalism. The change is important because capitalism means there's a further task, that the task of socialism, the task of communism, is not reducible to, although it's liable to be mistaken for, the same task as the bourgeois revolution, namely the emancipation of labor. No. That's the way it's going to appear, but that's socialist and communist as ideological phenomena, as false consciousness. As true consciousness, however, false with respect to its own historical understanding of itself, meaning that we will be replaying 1776, 1789, that we'll be replaying the bourgeois revolution in capitalism, trying to restore bourgeois social relations in the industrial era, but that will be a misrecognition, that will be a mistake. That will limit our ability to understand the task at hand, which is to overcome bourgeois social relations, not restore them. Even if the path of overcoming them also takes the form of, or appears as, seems motivated by, the attempt to restore them. So it's self-consciousness about that ideological appearance of the task. And that philosophy is part of that. So Marx, in his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, and also in the economic and philosophic manuscripts, although in a section that we did not read, it's in the Robert Tucker Marx Engels Reader, second edition that we were reading from, the critique of the Hegelian dialectic and philosophy as a whole, that's also in the manuscripts, it's beyond the section that we read, that in both of those places, Marx's critique of Hegel's philosophy of right and Marx's section on Hegel in the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, Marx says, Hegel's metaphysics, namely dialectics, is a metaphysics of labor. It's a metaphysics of the emancipation of labor. It's a metaphysics of freedom as labor. Self-recognition as labor, consciousness as achieved through labor. And Marx said as early as 1843 and 1844, he said the task of the proletariat is to abolish itself, not to realize itself, but to abolish itself, namely to abolish the metaphysics of labor, to overcome, to abolish in this respect, the freedom of labor, which is the freedom of bourgeois society, in practice as well as in theory. There's a practical metaphysics, as well as a theoretical metaphysics that governs our lives in capitalism, and that's the metaphysics of labor. But actually they've been superseded, but in this pathological way, by the industrial forces of production. Okay, so philosophy comes back parallel to the vulgarization of Marxism, the reification, the self-reification of Marxism, the ideologization and dogmatization of Marxism. Parallel to that, philosophy makes a comeback. And the Frankfurt School, controversially, especially Adorno, but also others like Max Horkheimer, who we read in the first day of class, The Little Man and the Philosophy of Freedom, and Herbert Marcuse, so those three especially, Horkheimer, Marcuse, and Adorno, take up philosophy as their object, as their phenomenon of immanent dialectical critique. And it's difficult to take on philosophy as a form of appearance when philosophy seems to be a way of making sense of the appearances, interpret the world, rather than change it. But Adorno says, well, to call philosophy obsolete while we're still in capitalism amounts to a defeatism of reason. meaning it's part of an abdication. So, now, defeatism of reason, that's kind of drastic. What this means is that after the attempt to change the world failed, the situation might be worse than it was before. We've lost our innocence. So, before the attempt to change the world, we might have not faced this defeatism of reason, but after the attempt to change the world miscarried, then we have this new problem, a defeatism of reason. Now, I mentioned the anti-philosophies of the 19th century, the anti-philosophies of the 1800s, in the era of capitalism, kind of bookending in some ways Marx and Engels' own careers, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. There was the despair, Kierkegaard, for sure, and there is the nihilism, but really the critique of nihilism by Nietzsche, the nihil of nihilism in Nietzsche, as Robert Pippin said. We needed Nietzsche for the nihil in nihilism. Then, in fact, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, although they're associated with this in the 20th century, they're not actually the defeatism of reason, not at all. They accept the task of philosophy in a certain respect. And in that way, they actually repeat Kant and Hegel in the 19th century. They are an attempt to have a critical philosophy, although it's mistaken for being an anti-philosophy. Indeed, it is a critical philosophy, but worse than the first version, Kant and Hegel, because in the era it's taking place in the era of capitalism rather than the era of the bourgeois revolution. And then in the 20th century, it undergoes a further degradation. Namely, the existentialism of the 20th century is a step down from Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, though it takes the existentialism of the 20th century, Heidegger and others, take Kierkegaard and Nietzsche as inspiration, as predecessors, as antecedents. Actually, they're worse than Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, from Adorno's perspective. And that's this defeatism of reason. So you don't really see an out-and-out defeatism of reason until the 20th century. And, picking on Heidegger and his influential army of Epigones, especially because Heidegger was a counter-revolutionary very explicitly, and as far as Marxism is concerned, and a Nazi even, although in that respect he was a revolutionary, because the Nazis wanted their own revolution, different from the Marxist revolution. But it is a regression, to use a term that Korsch introduced last week. So the capital C, capital T of critical theory that Adorno is participating in as a member of the Frankfurt School, as a younger member of the Frankfurt School, is younger than Horkheimer, is younger than Marcuse, he's younger than his friend Walter Benjamin, almost 10 years younger than all of them, which also means about 10 years younger than Lukács and Korsch. Korsch, I think, is a bit older even than that. He is the one who takes up the most thoroughly art, so he's known as an aesthetic theorist, and philosophy as domains of this immanent dialectical critique of phenomena in the Frankfurt School. Other people do more psychology and sociology, economics, social theory, social philosophy. But Adorno, when he's writing this book towards the end of his life in the 1960s, so we're jumping ahead, we're jumping from 1923 last week, all the way up now to 1966, Negative Dialectics, but we'll take a step back, and we'll be back in 1942, 1944, 45, 46, 47, with the readings we're going to be doing from Adorno tonight, in addition to Negative Dialectics. But one thing that had definitely happened is that the world revolution initiated in the Russian Revolution had failed, and the Soviet Union had apparently degenerated, from Adorno's perspective. And with it, Marxism had degenerated. Marxism becoming an official state ideology that exercised influence outside the state that it governed, the Soviet Union. It had degenerated. And that's what he gets into next. So he says, philosophy offers no place from which theory as such might be concretely convicted of the anachronisms it is suspected of, meaning, okay, defeatism of reason, is Marxism part of that defeatism of reason? Even Adorno's own Marxism, his own critical theory, might be suspected of a defeatism of reason. But he's saying, well, actually, philosophy doesn't offer a place that you might actually critique Marxism or critical theory of itself being a defeatism of reason. So he's looking at it that way, not just from the standpoint of how Marxism became a defeatism of reason. Korsch last week said Marxism mostly unceremoniously pushed aside philosophy. That's a certain kind of defeatism of reason. But here, it's like, okay, Marxism in its vulgar, ideologized, reified form, dogmatic form, was also a defeatism of reason. But he's saying, but actually, philosophers are not going to be able to convict theory, by which he means Marxism, of this, and of this anachronism. It is suspected of now as before, meaning Marxism might be suspected of being pre-philosophical, of being a kind of traditional metaphysics, especially materialism. Marxism as materialism might be a traditional metaphysical materialism, an ontological materialism, and often it is. Marxists will say, reality comes before thinking. That kind of materialism. Well, what's meant by that is very complicated, meaning that could mean Kant and Hegel's version that practice precedes theory, or social being precedes consciousness, or history gives rise to self-consciousness, or it could mean like physical reality comes before thinking, in which case it's a crude metaphysical materialism that's actually below that of bourgeois philosophers. And if Marxism appears to be that, then it seems like an anachronism on the one hand. On the other hand, there's another anachronism here. So these sentences are very charged, thick with meaning, which is Adorno holding on to an old-style Marxism that history has moved on from? And this would be true already in the 1930s and 1940s, and not only true by the 1960s. Is Adorno trying to retain the memory of that old-style Marxism, the Marxism of Marx and Engels and Lenin and Lukács and Korsch when they were writing in 1923? Is he trying to hold on to that, in which case critical theory is going to seem like an anachronism in that respect? And he says, now as before. So now as before means what? Well, that's another loaded phrase. We're going to encounter it many times in negative dialectics. Now as before. Now, meaning right now. Before, well, when is before? Maybe in the 1930s, when the Frankfurt School was separating itself from other strands of Marxism, when it would have been suspected of being a kind of relic of the past, an anachronism. Maybe Marxism itself was suspected of being an anachronism in the way that I was just talking about, a traditional metaphysical materialism in the 1800s in its own time. So before, back then, maybe, Marx and Engels themselves might have been suspected. Also, maybe Marxism in its high period leading up to World War I and the revolutions that come after World War I. The Marxism of the second period, according to Korsch, the Marxism of the period between the Paris Commune and the Russian Revolution. The Marxism of the Second Industrial Revolution, the Marxism of the Second International, or the Socialist International. That might have been the before, right? Because certainly contemporary thinkers, all sorts of thinkers, sociologists, philosophers of science, everybody regarded Marxism as an anachronism in its period when it reached its height as a mass movement, as a mass revolutionary movement in the advanced capitalist metropolitan countries before World War I. But he says, perhaps it was an inadequate interpretation which promised that it would be put into practice. Right, so he's sort of stepping to one side of Marxism and he's saying, okay, Marx wrote in the 11th thesis on Feuerbach. Philosophers have only interpreted the world, the point is to change it. But maybe the interpretation was inadequate. In other words, maybe the interpretation couldn't be taken for granted, but was itself inadequate. That promised that it would be put into practice. And then he goes on, theory cannot prolong the moment its critique depended on. Okay, so if Marx, and therefore Marxism, was born of critique of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, the anarchist who considered himself a follower of Adam Smith, Hegel, and the Bible, a follower of British political economy, German philosophy, and was himself a member of the French socialist movement. That's usually considered the three component parts of Marxism, according to official Lenin and also then Stalin. Whereas really, no, those are the things that Marxism critiqued. Those are the things that Marx critiqued. He critiqued British political economy. He critiqued German philosophy. He critiqued French socialism. He critiqued Proudhon. Why and how? He critiqued them as necessary forms of appearance of their historical moment. What became of bourgeois political economy in the era of industrial production, capitalism? What became of the French revolutionary tradition that had given birth to socialism in the industrial era? What became of German idealist philosophy, or modern German philosophy, or modern critical philosophy, Kant and Hegel? What became of that philosophy in the industrial capitalist era in the 19th century that made Marxism necessary? To recall the formulation from Louis Menand, Marx and Engels as philosophers of a second enlightenment. So why was the second enlightenment needed? Because maybe capitalism had changed things from the condition of bourgeois philosophy in the first enlightenment. So nonetheless, Adorno's writing in the 60s, is he trying to hold on to something, a moment that the critique depended on, and maybe it's past? A practice, he says, indefinitely delayed is no longer the forum for appeals against self-satisfied speculation. It is mostly the pretext used by executive authorities to choke as vain whatever critical thoughts the practical change would require. So to turn to practice and to say, oh, well, you need practice in order to have a critique, well, that's being used by the Stalinists. And not only the Stalinists, but also the Social Democratic and Second International Socialist parties after the Russian Revolution that had become counter-revolutionary and that had become governing capitalist parties, in fact. Having broken its pledge to be as one with reality, or at the point of realization, philosophy is obliged ruthlessly to criticize itself. Okay, so Kant and Hegel promised to be as one with reality, or at the point of the realization of reality. What does that mean? Well, the reality of revolution, according to Korsch last week, not just reality as a static proposition, as a state of affairs, as a state of being, but reality as a process of becoming, a process of transformation, a revolutionary process of freedom. But Adorno says it broke its pledge. So what does that mean? It means that bourgeois philosophy can't serve the need that Marxism tried to address. And therefore, philosophy is obliged ruthlessly to criticize itself. Meaning, maybe Marx was a philosopher, but in a new way yet again. So he's not a traditional philosopher, a traditional materialist metaphysician. He's not a bourgeois revolutionary philosopher. He's not Kant and Hegel. He's not a critical philosopher. But maybe there's a new philosophy of revolution. And that's again the Korsch idea from last week. Namely, critical philosophy in a new way. Namely, obliged to ruthlessly criticize itself. So again, that letter to Ruga, for the ruthless criticism of everything existing, including itself, including oneself. So the critique has to be self-critical in this way. Right. But then he folds Marxism back into the broader history of philosophy. He says, once upon a time, compared with sense perception and every kind of external experience, philosophy was felt to be the very opposite of naivete. And he says, now, however, in capitalism, it is objectively grown as naive, in its turn, as the seedy scholars feasting on subjective speculation seemed to Goethe 150 years ago. So Goethe, who predates, is a contemporary but really predates Kant and Hegel, and shares the moment with them. But he's reacting, Goethe, as they reacted to the traditional metaphysicians, and as Adam Smith reacted, and as Rousseau reacted against the traditional metaphysicians, the seedy scholars feasting on subjective speculation. He goes on, the introverted thought architect dwells behind the moon that is taken over by extroverted technicians. So is philosophy some kind of introvert activity existing in some speculative space that can't be seen, namely behind the moon? But behind the moon has already been taken over by extroverted technicians. Right, so I think that, I don't know if they had landed a unmanned space vehicle already on the moon in 1966, but they're about to. They hadn't put human beings on the moon yet, but I think they had sent probes. They had certainly sent probes to orbit the moon already at this point. He's publishing this. Okay, so he's sort of setting out here the possibility of philosophy, possibility of the critique of philosophy. Is there still a Marxist critique of philosophy? What's the current state of the Marxist critique of philosophy? Meaning, if Marx had a critique of philosophy in the 1840s, that was lost in the era of the Epigonies, according to Korsch, and then regained with the philosophy of revolution in 1917, the Russian Revolution, and others, Rosa Luxemburg, 1918, 1919, in Germany and elsewhere, Lukács, participating in the Hungarian Workers' Council Republic in 1919. Then what's the status of that critique of philosophy now? All right, so if Marxism as a critique of philosophy if that's been a central part of Marxism, where is that now in the 1960s? Right. Especially because philosophy itself, it's not just a linear progression. The regression that has overtaken philosophy has consumed it, has regressed it below the threshold of Rousseau and Kant and Hegel and Adam Smith and certainly Marx. That it is a more traditional metaphysics that now is manifest. We're going to see that his two examples of this are what he calls positivism or analytic philosophy. They're opposite examples. And Heideggerian ontology, Heidegger. That in the 20th century, after 1917, there's a recrudescence of philosophy that's different than the neo-Kantians and neo-Hegelians that Lukács and Korsch discussed. Also different from the philosophy after Hegel, that's wrestling with Hegel, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche. That the return of philosophy in the 20th century, the return of philosophy after 1917, is different. Now, I forgot to mention this last week, but I'll mention it now. Namely that Korsch, in his essay that we read in class, on Marxism and philosophy, Korsch said that if the revolution fails, and if philosophy comes back, it will come back in the form of pure epistemology and pure ontology. He might have also said pure ethics. So that there was a kind of, again, another trifurcation, a different kind of trifurcation, however, in the 20th century between ethical philosophy, ontological claims about the nature of being, and epistemology, how we know things. And you could say that analytic philosophy is pure epistemology, Heideggerian ontology is pure ontology, and again, ethics, which was left out, is sort of split down the middle, meaning people influenced by analytic philosophy try to do ethics, and people influenced by Heideggerian ontology also try to do ethics. But what would be important there would be the failure of philosophy. In other words, that there is an attempt to return to philosophy, but it mostly fails. It's mostly notable in its failure. But it's a radical failure at the level of epistemology, ontology, and ethics. All right, so what would a Marxist critique of that phenomenon, 20th century return of philosophy, be? How would Marxism have an imminent dialectical critique of quote-unquote philosophy in the form of epistemology, ontology, and ethics in the 20th century? Again, the two schools, the continental philosophy, that's Heideggerian, and the analytic philosophy, and the split down the difference in ethical philosophy between those two. What would Marxism have to say about that? And that's what Adorno is going to do in the bulk of the book. So we're only reading certain sections of the book. We're not reading the whole book. If you're interested, though, the book goes more into detail about Heidegger and analytic philosophy and into questions of ethics. We're focused on the parts that comment on Marxism and what happened to Marxism, also that bring in the philosophers who we read, Rousseau, Kant, Hegel. He also has Nietzsche and Freud, Sigmund Freud, in here, but we didn't read Nietzsche or Freud, so we're not going to be able to deal with that in any great detail, unfortunately. But we should be able to still get a lot of traction in the reading that we did do based on our prior readings from Rousseau and Kant and Hegel and Marx. All right, so where I wanted to go next is to look at the shorter readings that we had on our agenda. Namely, the reflections on class theory and the imaginative excesses. But before that, I wanted to look at this by way of why still philosophy, at least look a little bit at some passages there. And then I have included in the additional readings folder in the files on Canvas, I have some aphorisms from Adorno's book Minima Moralia, written in the 1940s, and of which Imaginative Excesses is actually an orphaned aphorism. It's an orphaned part. It was taken out of the final published version. Just to give us some sort of thesis statements of Adorno, so sort of some parameters for how he's approaching things. So let's look at why still philosophy. Okay, so Adorno says, to the question such as why still philosophy, for the formulation of which I myself am responsible, although its dilettantish tone does not escape me, most people will already guess the answer. They will expect a train of thought that accumulates all kinds of difficulties and reservations in order to lead ultimately more or less cautiously to a nevertheless, and the affirmation of what at first had been rhetorically cast into doubt. This all too familiar circuit corresponds to a conformist and apologetic attitude, basically an affirmative attitude. that characterizes itself as positive and reckons in advance on consent, meaning it's trying to sort of gain the consent of the listeners. This is a lecture that he gave. And indeed, perhaps nothing better can be expected from someone whose job it is to teach philosophy, whose bourgeois existence depends on its continued survival, philosophy's continued survival, and who undermines his own immediate interests as soon as he contests it. So if Adorno teaches philosophy, of course he's not going to undermine his livelihood, namely philosophy as a subject. Or is he? All that notwithstanding, I have some right to raise the question for the simple reason that I am not at all sure of the answer. Anyone who defends a cause deemed obsolete and superfluous by the spirit of the age, so he's saying, in the 1960s, in the 1950s and 60s, when he's working on this book, Negative Dialectics, that he publishes in 1966, because he gives some lectures in the late 50s that contribute to this book, the spirit of the age is pretty inimical to philosophy. So even though Heidegger is popular, there is a fashion for Heidegger, nonetheless, it's as a kind of dissident, as a kind of a minor note in the prevailing dominant treatment of philosophy, which is more analytic philosophy, and in that respect, actually kind of hostile to philosophy. It's anti-philosophy in another sense. Heidegger is also anti-philosophy in yet another sense, but we'll talk about that. That has more to do with Heidegger's idea that Western metaphysics has produced capitalism and the self-destruction of the world, and that's traceable back to the ancient Greeks. That really with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, a kind of a self-destructive metaphysics was unleashed on the world that is unique to the West, and that has culminated in capitalism and all of its destructiveness. Okay? But the more dominant form, the spirit of the age, is really not philosophical at all. It's more scientific. It's more scientific modeled on the physical sciences, and it's more positivistic. It's less critical. And, it's technological. It's technical. And therefore, philosophy in the way that Adorno wants to address it, and in the manner he's going to address it. So the kind of object he's looking at and the way he's looking at it as a critical theorist is going to seem obsolete and superfluous. It's going to seem like he's raising old questions that we've moved on from after World War II, for sure. He says, he must know that philosophy is no longer applicable to the techniques for mastering one's life. Techniques in both the literal and figurative senses, with which philosophy was once so closely entwined. And philosophy no longer offers a medium of self-cultivation beyond these techniques, as was the case during the era of Hegel, when for a few short decades the very small class of German intellectuals communicated in their collective philosophical language. That's the 25 years of philosophy that I mentioned. The birth and culmination of philosophy between Kant and Hegel. He says, roughly since the death of Kant, philosophy has made itself suspect because of its disparity with the positive sciences, especially the natural sciences, and it was the first discipline in public awareness to succumb to the crisis of the humanistic concept of culture, about which he says, I need not say a great deal. So, meaning, in the 19th century, the spirit of science seemed to really leave behind the more quaint bourgeois humanistic ethos coming out of the Renaissance. It's also true in the realm of art, by the way. He says, the Kantian and Hegelian revivals, whose titles alone already reveal the feebleness of their programs, have not changed the situation much, meaning people have tried to return to and revive Kant and Hegel, but it actually hasn't amounted to much, he says. Finally, in the general tendency towards specialization, philosophy too has established itself as a specialized discipline, one purified of all specific content. So it's like pure logic, again, pure epistemology, or a kind of pure ontology, a pure speculation about being. whether as a formal logic, he says, in theory of science, or as the legend of being beyond all beings. Philosophy declared its bankruptcy regarding concrete societal goals. Oh, there were societal goals. Well, what he said earlier, mastering one's life. What about the collective mastering of life, societally? Okay, and that actually takes me to where I wanted to go with the selections from Minima Moralia that I have in the additional readings. So let me turn to that. After we look at the conclusion of Why Still Philosophy. Philosophy should not, with foolish arrogance, set about collecting information and then take a position. Rather, it must unrestrictedly, without recourse to some mental refuge, experience. It must do exactly what is avoided by those who refuse to forsake the maxim that every philosophy must finally produce something positive. Rimbaud, that's a modernist poet, modernist French poet, Rimbaud. I am absolutely modern. Is neither an aesthetic program nor a program for aesthetes. It is a categorical imperative of philosophy. Whoever wants nothing to do with the trajectory of history belongs all the more truly to it. So the people who try to be ahistorical or transhistorical, who try to eternalize through philosophy, through philosophical truth, in a kind of pre-critical, pre-Kantian way, make themselves all the more part of the reality of history that they're trying to resist. History promises no salvation and offers the possibility of hope only to the concept whose movement follows history's path to the very extreme. And that would be, for Adorno, writing in the 60s, that would be Marxism. Meaning Marxism, in its imminent dialectical critique, is following the trajectory of history, capitalism, to the very extreme. Okay, we have here the dedication to Minima Moralia. It's a dedication to Horkheimer. So Adorno said that he's dedicating the book to Horkheimer, but we'll see also what the book is supposed to be about. He says, "The melancholy science from which I make this offering to my friend relates to a region that from time immemorial was regarded as the true field of philosophy, but which, since the latter's conversion into method, has lapsed into intellectual neglect, sententious whimsy, and finally oblivion, namely the teaching of the good life." So he says that's the true field of philosophy, the teaching of the good life. What the philosophers once knew as life has become the sphere of private existence and now of mere consumption, dragged along as an appendage of the process of material production without autonomy or substance of its own. He who wishes to know the truth about life in its immediacy must scrutinize its estranged form, its alienated form, the objective powers that determine individual existence even in its most hidden recesses. To speak immediately of the immediate is to behave much as those novelists who drape their marionettes in imitated bygone passions like cheap jewelry, and make people who are no more than component parts of machinery act as if they still had the capacity to act as subjects, and as if something depended on their actions. Our perspective of life has passed into an ideology, which conceals the fact that there is life no longer. It's actually one of the epigraphs of this book, Minima Moralia. Life does not live. He also has another zinger. Wrong life cannot be lived rightly. So these are peppered throughout the book, that we're just looking at these little bits from. Let me jump ahead here. So he says, considerations which start from the subject remain false to the same extent that life has become appearance. For since the overwhelming objectivity of historical movement in its present phase, in capitalism, consists, so far, only in the dissolution of the subject, without yet giving rise to a new one, individual experience necessarily bases itself on the old subject, now historically condemned, which is still for itself but no longer in itself. So that would be the bourgeois subject. The subject still feels sure of its autonomy, but the nullity demonstrated to subjects by the concentration camp is already overtaking the form of subjectivity itself. Subjective reflection, even if critically alerted to itself, has something sentimental and anachronistic about it. Right, so even critical philosophy has something sentimental and anachronistic about it. Something of a lament over the course of the world. A lament to be rejected not for its good faith, but because the lamenting subject threatens to become arrested in its condition, and so to fulfill in its turn the law of the world's course. So he says, fidelity to one's own state of consciousness and experience is forever in temptation of lapsing into infidelity by denying the insight that transcends the individual and calls his substance by its name. Thus Hegel, whose method schooled that of Minima Moralia, argued against the mere being for itself of subjectivity on all its levels. Dialectical theory, abhorring anything isolated, cannot admit aphorisms as such. Let me jump ahead here. The dismissive gesture which Hegel, in contradiction to his own insight, constantly accords the individual, derives paradoxically enough from his necessary entanglement in liberalistic thinking. This is something that we'll address in Negative Dialectics. The conception of a totality, harmonious through all its antagonisms, compels him to assign to individuation, however much he may designate it as a driving moment in the process, an inferior status in the construction of the whole. This is also true of Kant in his idea for universal history from a cosmopolitan point of view. The knowledge that in prehistory the objective tendency asserts itself over the heads of human beings, indeed by virtue of annihilating individual qualities, without the reconciliation of general and particular, constructed in thought, ever yet being accomplished in history, is distorted in Hegel. With serene indifference, he opts once again for liquidation of the particular. Nowhere in his work is the primacy of the whole doubted. So he says, Hegel, in hypostasizing both bourgeois society and its fundamental category, the individual, did not truly carry through the dialectic between the two. Certainly he perceives with classical economics that the totality produces and reproduces itself precisely from the interconnection of the antagonistic interests of its members. But the individual as such, he for the most part considers naively as an irreducible datum, just what in his theory of knowledge he decomposes. Nevertheless, in an individualistic society, the general not only realizes itself through the interplay of particulars, but society is essentially the substance of the individual. Alright, so what he says is, in the 150 years since Hegel's conception was formed, some of the force of protest has reverted to the individual. Compared to the patriarchal meagerness that characterizes his treatment in Hegel, the individual has gained as much in richness, differentiation, and vigor as, on the other hand, the socialization of society has enfeebled and undermined him. In the period of his decay, the individual's experience of himself and what he encounters contributes once more to knowledge, which he had merely obscured as long as he continued unshaken to construe himself positively as the dominant category. In face of the totalitarian unison with which the eradication of difference is proclaimed as a purpose in itself, even part of the social force of liberation may have temporarily withdrawn to the individual sphere. If critical theory lingers there, it is not only with a bad conscience. All of this is not meant to deny what is indisputable in such an attempt. The major part of this book was written during the war, that's World War II, under conditions enforcing contemplation. The violence, he says, that expelled me thereby denied me full knowledge of it. I did not yet to admit to myself the complicity that enfolds all those who, in the face of unspeakable collective events, speak of individual matters at all. Okay, so that's one bit. Show you how we're doing for time. Okay, look at one other short piece, and this is from Minima Moralia. This is Bequest. We're going to skip around in this and not read the whole thing. This is about his friend Walter Benjamin, and we're going to read another piece. We'll read a piece by Benjamin together in order to get at this category that he's introducing here, Bequest. It says, dialectical thought is an attempt to break through the coercion of logic by its own means. But since it must use these means, it is at every moment in danger of itself acquiring a coercive character. The ruse of reason would like to hold sway over the dialectic too. The existing cannot be overstepped except by means of a universal derived from the existing order itself. The universal triumphs over the existing through the latter's own concept, and therefore in its triumph, the power of mere existence constantly threatens to reassert itself by the same violence that broke it. So this is the dialectic of nature and spirit, the dialectic of the extant and the actual, the dialectic of being and becoming, that we talked about already on the first day of class. Through the absolute rule of negation, the movement of thought, as of history, becomes in accordance with the pattern of immanent antithesis, unambiguously, exclusively, implacably positive. Everything is subsumed under the principal economic phases in their development, which each in turn historically shape the whole of society. Let me jump ahead here. It says, stringency and totality, the bourgeois intellectual ideals of necessity and generality, do indeed circumscribe the formula of history. But for just this reason, the constitution of society finds its precipitate in those great immovable lordly concepts against which dialectical criticism and practice are directed. So he's citing here a famous essay by Benjamin, The Theses on the Philosophy of History. It says, if Walter Benjamin said that history had hitherto been written from the standpoint of the victor and needed to be written from the standpoint of the vanquished, we might add that knowledge must indeed present the fatally rectilinear succession of victory and defeat, but should also address itself to those things which were not embraced by this dynamic, which fell by the wayside, what might be called the waste products and blind spots that have escaped the dialectic. It is in the nature of the defeated, so in this case, of course, he's talking about socialism, Marxism itself, to appear in their impotence, irrelevant, eccentric, derisory. What transcends the ruling society is not only the potentiality it develops, but all that which did not fit properly into the laws of historical movement. Theory must needs deal with cross-grained, opaque, unassimilated material, which as such admittedly has from the start an anachronistic quality, but is not wholly obsolete since it has outwitted the historical dynamic. This can be seen readily in art. Children's books like Alice in Wonderland and Struwwelpeter, of which it would be absurd to ask whether they are progressive or reactionary, contain incomparably more eloquent ciphers, even of history, than the high drama of Hebel, concerned though it is with the official themes of tragic guilt, turning points of history, the course of the world, and the individual. And in Satie, Eric Satie, who's a French composer, in his pert and puerile piano pieces, there are flashes of experience undreamed of by the school of Arnold Schoenberg. By the way, that's Adorno was a musician, and he studied with Schoenberg and his students, with all of its rigor and the pathos of musical development behind it. The very grandeur of logical deductions may inadvertently take on a provincial quality. Benjamin's writings are an attempt in ever new ways to make philosophically fruitful what has not yet been foreclosed by great intentions. The task he bequeathed us was not to abandon such an attempt to the estranging enigmas of thought alone, but to bring the intentionless within the realm of concepts, the obligation to think at the same time dialectically and undialectically. That's what we're going to look at with the readings for tonight. The obligation is to think at the same time dialectically and undialectically. So why do we need to think dialectically and undialectically? Well, he gives us some indications here. So these are the last two aphorisms of Minima Moralia: the warning not to be misused, and the finale. So let's look at warning not to be misused, although we're not going to look at the entire thing. He says, the dialectic stems from the sophists. It was a mode of discussion whereby dogmatic assertions were shaken, and as the public prosecutors and comic writers put it, the lesser word made the stronger. So dialectic originates with sophism, but then he says it's subsequently developed as against perennial philosophy, or philosophia perennis, into a perennial method of criticism, a refuge for all the thoughts of the oppressed, even those unthought by them. That's the dialectic. But as a means of proving oneself right, it was also from the first an instrument of domination, a formal technique of apologetics, unconcerned with content, serviceable to those who could pay. The principle of constantly and successfully turning the tables. Its truth or untruth, therefore, is not inherent in the method itself, but in its intention in the historical process. So the dialectic is constantly in this ambiguous place of being sophistry, and that could serve either the weak against the strong, or it could serve to ratify the strength of the strong. It could be used to protest against domination, or it could be used to enforce domination. So it depends on how it's being used, what's its intention in the historical process, meaning at the moment in history that it's manifesting, the purpose of the dialectic is different. The splitting of the Hegelian school into a left and a right wing was founded on the ambiguity of the theory no less than in the political situation preceding the 1848 revolution. So the fact that there were right Hegelians and there were left Hegelians, and Marx and Engels are left Hegelians, has to do with the ambiguity of the theory, and not only the ambiguity of the political situation leading to the revolution of 1848. Dialectical thought includes not only the Marxian doctrine that the proletariat as the absolute object of history is capable of becoming its first social subject and realizing the conscious self-determination of mankind, but dialectical thought also includes the joke that Gustave Doré attributes to a parliamentary representative of the Ancien regime, that without Louis XVI there would never have been a revolution, and so that he is to be thanked for the rights of man. Meaning if Louis XVI hadn't made the mistakes that he made, then we wouldn't have the French Revolution, and we wouldn't have had the Declaration of the Rights of Human Being and Citizen, written by Lafayette, French military hero of the American Revolution, Thomas Jefferson, the ambassador to France from America, and the Abbé Sieyès, who wrote the pamphlet in 1789, saying that the third estate was nothing, but it shall be everything, meaning the bourgeois commoners were going to overthrow the aristocracy and the priesthood. But that would never have happened if Louis XVI hadn't been the fallible figure that he was. Negative philosophy, dissolving everything, dissolves even the dissolvent. Right, so he's introducing here what we're going to see, the dialectic of the dialectic, or the dialectical critique of dialectics. We had this already a little bit with Lukács and Horsch. But the new form in which it claims to suspend and preserve both, dissolved and dissolvent, can never emerge in a pure state from an antagonistic society. The dialectic, that is. As long as domination reproduces itself, the old quality reappears, unrefined, in the dissolving of the dissolvent. In a radical sense, no leap is made at all by the dialectic. That would only happen with the liberating event itself. So the dialectical method, before emancipation, is something else. Because the dialectical determination of the new quality always finds itself referred back to the violence of the objective tendency that propagates domination, it is placed under the almost inescapable compulsion whenever it has conceptually achieved the negation of the negation to substitute, even in thought, the bad old order for the non-existent alternative. The depth to which it penetrates objectivity is bought with complicity in the lie that objectivity is truth. Okay, let's jump ahead here. Okay, so what he says is, to protect itself from such temptations as apologizing for reality, an enlightened dialectic, or a self-critical dialectic, needs to guard it incessantly against this apologetic restorative element which is, after all, inherent in sophistication, or in sophisms. The threatening relapse of reflection into unreflectedness gives itself away by the facility with which the dialectical procedure shuttles its arguments, as if it were itself that immediate knowledge of the whole which the very principle of the dialectic precludes. The standpoint of totality is adopted in order, with the schoolmasterly "that is not what I meant," to deprive one's opponent of any definite negative judgment, and at the same time violently to break off the movement of concepts, to arrest the dialectic by pointing to the insuperable inertia of facts. The thinker uses the dialectic instead of giving himself up to it. In this way, thought, masterfully dialectical, reverts to the pre-dialectical stage, the serene demonstration of the fact that there are two sides to everything. And finale. He says, the only philosophy which can be responsibly practiced in face of despair is the attempt to contemplate all things as they would present themselves from the standpoint of redemption. Knowledge has no light but that shed on the world by redemption. All else is reconstruction and mere technique. Perspectives must be fashioned that displace and estrange the world, reveal it to be, with its rifts and crevices, as indigent and distorted as it will appear one day in the messianic light. To gain such perspectives without gaiety or violence, entirely from felt contact with its objects, this alone is the task of thought. It is the simplest of all things, because the situation calls imperatively for such knowledge, indeed because consummate negativity, once squarely faced, delineates the mirror image of its opposite. But it is also the utterly impossible thing, because it presupposes a standpoint removed, even though by a hair's breadth, from the scope of existence. Whereas we well know that any possible knowledge must not only be first wrested from what is, if it shall hold good, but is also marked for this very reason by the same distortion and indigence which it seeks to escape. The more passionately thought denies its conditionality for the sake of the unconditional, the more unconsciously and so calamitously it is delivered up to the world. Even its own impossibility it must at last comprehend for the sake of the possible. But beside the demand thus placed on thought, the question of the reality or unreality of redemption itself hardly matters. Okay, so what would it mean to look at things from the standpoint of redemption? That's what we're going to look at. Where is the Benjamin we want to look at? And then we'll take a break after we look at this. This one's a little bit of a doozy. But he does use this language of redemption throughout Negative Dialectics, as well as in the short readings that we did, in addition to the Negative Dialectics readings tonight. And so we do need to explicate what redemption means. So to look at things from the standpoint of redemption, from the standpoint of potential redemption, from the standpoint of the task of redemption. Okay, so this is Walter Benjamin, who you guys may have read his work of art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. That's probably the most cited text of his. The second most cited text of his is his Theses on the Philosophy of History, or more properly titled On the Concept of History. We'll be looking at the Reflections on Class Theory, which is in some ways a response to that piece, to the Theses on the Philosophy of History. In that, he argues for this perspective of redemption, which is usually mistaken for a naively theological category. But he's going to see what he means by this is different. So the theologico-political fragment. Okay, so redemption, the Redeemer. So who's the Redeemer? The Redeemer is the Messiah. So he says, only the Messiah himself, so this is starting with theology, consummates all history, in the sense that he alone redeems, completes, and creates history's relation to the Messianic. For this reason, nothing historical can relate itself on its own account to anything Messianic, because he consummates all of history, and therefore redeems, and therefore relates the history to the Messianic. It says, therefore the kingdom of God is not the telos of the historical dynamic. It cannot be set as a goal. From the standpoint of history, it is not the goal, but the end. So what is this all about? So it's about the end times. So it's about, in religion, and the so-called Abrahamic faiths, in the Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, there is this idea of the end of days, the end times, the end of history. So the end of history is when everything is redeemed. When the Messiah comes, whether for the first time or for the second time. So for the first time with Judaism, for the second time with Islam, and in a sense, the second time with Islam as well. That would be the end of history. It's the end of time. Right, so it's not what history is leading towards, but it's just the cessation of it. It's just the terminus. That's why he says it's not the telos, it's not the goal, it's just the end. So why is that? Because the beginning of time, in a religious metaphysics and theology, the beginning of time is the expulsion from paradise. It's the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. So that happens according to the Bible and the Quran, insofar as it follows the Bible. Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, Adam and Eve, are tempted by Satan to defy God and eat the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge. And when they do that, God punishes them by expelling them from paradise. So in paradise, they didn't get sick, they didn't grow old, they didn't die. They also didn't biologically reproduce. And not only they, but everything in paradise was eternal. Didn't experience time. Didn't die. Didn't get sick. Didn't decay. So the expulsion from paradise introduces time in the world. It introduces mortality. It introduces history. So he says, therefore the order of the profane cannot be built up on the idea of the divine kingdom, and therefore theocracy has no political but only a religious meaning. So the profane is the temporal world. It's the world in which time happens and in which history takes place. So it is the world of mortality. That's the profane. The sacred, by contrast, the soul is eternal. And therefore, what is sacred is everything that one does to preserve the sanctity of the soul, as opposed to profane existence. So he says, history must be built up on the basis of the profane, not on the basis of the sacred. He says, therefore theocracy has no political but only a religious meaning. To have repudiated with utmost vehemence the political significance of theocracy is the cardinal merit of his friend Ernst Bloch's Spirit of Utopia. So he's not embracing theology, he's repudiating it with utmost vehemence at a political level. Right? He's saying there can be no theocracy. So theology and the political are being divorced here. Theology is about the sacred, the political is about the profane. He says the order of the profane should be erected, so this is where history takes place, on the idea of happiness. The relation of this order to the messianic is one of the essential teachings of the philosophy of history. It is the precondition of a mystical conception of history containing a problem that can be represented figuratively if one arrow points to the goal towards which the profane dynamic acts, happiness, and another marks the direction of messianic intensity, then certainly the quest of free humanity for happiness runs counter to the messianic direction. So the messianic direction of redemption is the opposite of the actual direction of history, which is the pursuit of happiness. Right, so all have rights to liberty, freedom, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The quest of free humanity for happiness is the order on which history is based, the profane dynamic of history. He says, but just as a force can, through acting, increase another that is acting in the opposite direction, so the order of the profane assists, through being profane, the coming of the messianic kingdom. The profane, therefore, although not itself a category of this kingdom, is a decisive category of its quietist approach. For in happiness, he writes, all that is earthly seeks its downfall, and only in good fortune is its downfall destined to find it. Whereas admittedly the immediate messianic intensity of the heart of the inner man in isolation passes through misfortune as suffering. To the spiritual restitutio in integrum, which introduces immortality, corresponds a worldly restitution that leads to the eternity of downfall. What is he talking about here? So restitutio in integrum, it's this old idea that at the end of time, at the end of history, when the Messiah comes and when everything is redeemed, everything will be restored physically, bodily. Right, so the dead will be brought back to life, everything will be restored. Everything that has ever died, everything in nature. Right, so bodily restoration is part of the promise of redemption at the end of time, at the end of history. So all the ravages of time, all the ravages of history will be undone. That's what the messianic redemption promises, outside of history, outside of time. He says the rhythm of this eternally transient worldly existence, transient in its totality, in its spatial but also in its temporal totality, the rhythm of messianic nature is happiness. So the eternal downfall that demands, through its transiency, redemption, restoration, including physical restoration, is happiness. So the quest for happiness and the demand for redemption are this kind of rhythm. For nature is messianic, he writes, by reason of its eternal and total passing away. Meaning, what is eternal in nature? the fact that nothing is eternal. To strive after such passing, even for those stages of man that are nature, is the task of world politics, whose method must be called nihilism. Okay, so what does that mean? So not just the mere passing away of things, either in good fortune or in misfortune, in happiness or in unhappiness, but the active striving for such passing. So what he has in mind here is a quotation from Goethe that Friedrich Engels, Marx's colleague, comrade, friend, cited in his book Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, which is actually excerpted in the Marx Engels Reader, if you're interested. There he quoted Goethe's Dr. Faustus. He quoted the character Mephistopheles, the devil, who said, "Everything that exists deserves to perish." So Engels quoted that as the attitude that he and Marx had towards historical reality. Everything that exists deserves to perish. So not only the ruthless criticism of everything existing, but the striving after its perishing. Everything that exists deserves to perish. So to strive after such perishing, to strive after such passing away, even for those historical stages of man that are nature, is the task of world politics, whose method must be called nihilism. The method is nihilism. The goal is not nihilism, but the method is nihilism. It's Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. Right? The point is to overcome capitalism, and that's going to look like nihilism, but in fact, it's an attempt to transcend the nihilism of capitalism itself. And that generates this demand for redemption. Right? The suffering of capitalism demands redemption, and the question therefore is, what would that redemption mean? What would a political, profane, secular, historical redemption be, as opposed to the religious messianic redemption that takes place outside of history? Secular, just means temporal. Secular, the opposite of secular, is celestial. So celestial authority, the authority of the church, the authority of religion, the authority of scripture is celestial. It's eternal like the stars, although now we know that the stars are not actually eternal, as opposed to the secular world, or the temporal world, or the profane world. So, celestial authority, church, scripture, religion. Temporal authority, secular authority, political authority. That's a traditional distinction made in civilizations. There's temporal authority and then there's celestial authority. Temporal authority is political authority. So Jesus said, render unto Caesar what Caesar is due, but render unto God what God is due. And the meaning of that is respect secular authority, respect political, temporal authority, but recognize that it is not celestial, divine, eternal authority. Well, here, of course, it's not about respecting political authority, it's about overthrowing political authority. And that's going to appear to be part of the eternal passing away of nature in the course of time, in the course of the temporal, secular world, in the course of history. And yet that generates a demand for redemption, as Adorno pointed out in the passage from Minima Moralia on redemption. To look at things from the standpoint of redemption, that really what needs to look at what didn't fit into the apparent logic of history, what dropped out, what was wasted, what was not realized in the course of history. Benjamin described this in the Theses on the Philosophy of History as reading history against the grain. So the demand for redemption is the demand to realize what capitalist history has not realized, and yet could still be realized, or that would seem to motivate the desire to overcome capitalism. the task, the striving to overcome capitalism, would appear to be to realize, to redeem the unrealized potential that capitalism has squandered, that capitalism has wasted. Okay. Let's take a short break and then we'll come back in about 5 or 10 minutes. Okay, let's resume. Alright, sorry for the marathonic character of the discussion tonight and really my lecturing. Let me... Okay, so let's turn to the reflections on class theory. Look at that. This is in keeping with the immanent dialectical critique of not only philosophy, but of dialectics itself. So the immanent dialectical critique of dialectics. But let's see how Adorno proceeds here. So we've got reflections on class theory. Up on my screen. So he is going to bring in Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto by reference, but then we'll see what he does with it. Because according to theory, history is the history of class struggles. But the concept of class is bound up with the emergence of the proletariat. Even when it was still revolutionary, the bourgeoisie called itself the third estate, it didn't call itself a class. By extending the concept of class to prehistory, theory, by that he means Marxism, denounces not just the bourgeois, whose freedom, together with their possessions and education, perpetuates the tradition of the old injustice. It also turns against prehistory itself. It destroys the illusion of a good-natured patriarchy that had been assumed by prehistory following the victory of inexorable capitalist calculation. So in hindsight, from the standpoint of capitalism, it looks like pre-capitalism is happy. It wasn't, right? It was also a realm of class division. The venerable unity of a traditional structure, the natural right of hierarchy in a society that was presented as having grown organically, turned out to be the unity of interested parties. That hierarchy had always been a coercive organization designed for the appropriation of the labor of others. Natural law is historical injustice that has become obsolete. The articulated organism is a system of divisiveness. The picture of the estates is the ideology that, with its themes of honest merit, loyal work, and lastly, the exchange of equivalents, was ideally suited to the newly installed bourgeoisie. By exposing the historical necessity that had brought capitalism into being, political economy became the critique of history as a whole, whose immutable nature was the source of the privileged status of capitalism, as well as its forebears. To recognize the catastrophic violence in the latest form of injustice, that is to say, the latent injustice contained in fair exchange, means simply to identify it with the prehistory that it destroyed. If all the oppression that man has ever inflicted on man culminates in the modern age, in the cold inhumanity of free wage labor, then the past is revealed in conditions and things, the romantic contrast to industrial reason, as the trace of former suffering. The archaic silence of pyramids and ruins becomes conscious of itself in materialist thought. It is the echo of factory noise in the landscape of the immutable. Let me jump ahead. This implies that the philosophical idea of eternal truth had sprung from the contemplation of present torment. All history is the history of class struggles because it was always the same thing, namely prehistory. This gives us a pointer as to how we can recognize what history is. From the most recent form of injustice, a steady light reflects back on history as a whole. Only in this way can theory enable us to use the full weight of history to gain an insight into the present without succumbing in resignation to the burden of the past. Members of the bourgeoisie and their supporters have been loud in their praise of Marxism on account of its dynamism, in which they detect the same industrious mimicry of history that characterizes their own efforts. According to the appreciative comments of Ernst Troeltsch in his book on historicism, Marxist dialectic has, quote, preserved its constructive power and its ability to adapt to the fundamental mobility of the real, close quote. This praise of the constructive ability to adapt arouses our distrust of that fundamental mobility. Dynamism is merely one side of dialectic. It is the side preferred by the belief in practicality, masterful action, the indefatigable can-do attitude, because constant change is the best way to conceal the old untruth. The other, less popular aspect of the dialectic is its static side. The self-movement of the concept, the conception of history as a syllogism, as it is to be found in Hegel's philosophy, is no developmental doctrine. It was only turned into one by the collusive misunderstanding of the humanities. The law that, according to the Hegelian dialectic, governs the restlessly destructive unfolding of the ever-new consists in the fact that at every moment the ever-new is also the old lying close at hand. The new does not add itself to the old, but remains the old in distress, in its hour of need, as it becomes topical, as an imminent contradiction through its act of reflection, its indispensable confrontation with the universal in the old. Thus, throughout all its antithetical mediations, history remains one vast analytic proposition. That is the historical essence of the metaphysical doctrine of the identity of subject and object in the absolute. That's Hegel. The system of history, the elevation of the temporal to the totality of meaning, abolishes time and reduces it to an abstract negation. As a philosophy, Marxism remained true to this. It confirms Hegelian idealism as prehistory's knowledge of its own identity, but it puts it back on its feet by unmasking that identity as prehistorical. So Marx famously said that he took Hegel and put him back on his feet, that Hegel was standing on his head and he put Hegel back on his feet. For Marxism, the identical truly becomes a state of need, the need of the human beings who are merely articulated by the concept. This is what I mentioned earlier, the non-identity of idea and reality, or of ideal and reality, the non-identity of social being and consciousness, the non-identity of our theory and practice with the historical conditions in which we try to be subjective agents. The irreconcilable power of the negative that sets history in motion is the power of what exploiters do to the victims. As a shackle binding one generation to the next, it functions as an obstacle to both freedom and history. The systematic unity of history, which is supposed to give meaning to individual suffering, or else demote it from on high to the level of something fortuitous, is the philosophical appropriation of the labyrinth in which people have toiled to this day, the epitome of suffering. Within the sphere of influence of the system, the new, progress, is, like the old, a constant source of new disaster. Knowing the new does not mean adapting oneself to it and to the movement of history. It means resisting its inflexibility and conceiving of the onward march of the battalions of world history as marking time. Theory knows of no constructive force, but only of one that lights up the contours of a burned-out prehistory with the glow of the latest disaster, in order to perceive the parallel that exists between them. The latest thing is always the old terror, the myth which consists in that blind continuum of time that continually retracts itself with patient, stupidly omniscient malice. This is Achno's ass, or Achno's mule, which eats the rope as fast as he twines it. Only he who recognizes that the new is the same old thing will be of service to whatever is different. Okay, so if you remember from the dialectic of being and becoming, nature is the same. It's the given and the same. And spirit is the movement that brings forth the new and the different. Right, so what he's saying here is that in capitalism, the new is actually not new and different in the sense of something beyond capitalism, but it's only the new form of capitalism, in which case it's just the old repeating itself. All right, one of the things that he gets at in this essay in its entirety that we're not going to address now, but is then there for you guys to have read, is the changing situation of class by the end of the 1930s and in the period of World War II. He wrote this in the 1940s. Namely, what he calls the proletarianization of the bourgeoisie. So in fascism especially, in Nazism maybe most of all, but also in the rise of the state through things like the New Deal in the United States, that members of the capitalist class are not really protected by their position. They're proletarianized, meaning they can be ruthlessly done away with by the state, by the ruling interests, as easily as anyone else. Their wealth doesn't protect them. Their social status doesn't protect them. So there's a proletarianization of the bourgeoisie that has taken place in what he calls the mockery of the classless society. Now, one could say that was true throughout the capitalist era, but it's most especially true in the political situation of the mid-20th century. This is the era of totalitarianism, in short, and the administered state, what he calls the administered state, the authoritarian state that rises over and rules all of society rather than just being an agency of the ruling class. So the proletarianization of the bourgeoisie, the universalization of proletarianization. Sociologists of the time called it the theory of rackets, meaning that society is not really a class hierarchy, but it's just a hierarchy of rackets. It's the big rackets and the small rackets, including labor unions, which are the small rackets, in comparison to the huge capitalist monopolies, which are the big rackets. And the state itself becomes a racket of its own. So the police form their own racket, governmental agencies form their own little rackets. Right? And he calls this the mockery of the classless society, which is also the mockery of the class society, because it's actually very different from the Marxist conception of class. The Marxist conception of class is not just about the groups that rule society. It's about the structure of capitalism and the contradiction of capitalism. I'm just going to jump ahead to the end here and then move on to some of the other reading that we did. He says, by reproducing the life of society in a planned way, so this is through the administrative authoritarian state, the ruling classes reproduce the impotence of those that are planned. Thus, domination becomes an integral part of human beings. They do not need to be influenced, as liberals with their ideas of the market are wont to imagine. Mass culture simply makes them yet again what they already are, thanks to the coercion of the system. It keeps a watchful eye on the anomalies, introduces the official complement of practice in the shape of public morality, and provides people with models for imitation. The task of influencing people who beg to differ cannot be entrusted to films that stretch the credulity even of the like-minded. The vestiges of the ideologies that mediated between autonomy and domination disappear along with the vestiges of autonomy. Dehumanization is no external power, no propaganda, however conceived, no exclusion from culture. It is precisely the intrinsic reality of the oppressed in the system, who used formerly to stand out because of their wretchedness, whereas today their wretchedness lies in the fact that they can never escape, that they suspect that the truth is propaganda, while swallowing the propaganda culture that is fetishized and distorted into the madness of an unending reflection of themselves. This means, however, he says, that the dehumanization is also its opposite. In reified human beings, reification finds its outer limits. They catch up with the technical forces of production, in which the relations of production lie hidden. In this way, these relations lose the shock of their alien nature because the alienation is so complete. But they may soon also lose their power. Only when the victims completely assume the features of the ruling civilization will they be capable of wresting them from the dominant power. The only remaining differentiating factor is reduced to naked usurpation. Only in its blind anonymity could the economy appear as fate. Its spell is broken by the horror of the seeing dictatorship. The mimicking of the classless society by class society has been so successful that while the oppressed have all been co-opted, the futility of all oppression becomes manifest. The ancient myth proves to be quite feeble in its new omnipotence. Even if the dynamic at work was always the same, its end today is not the end. Okay, the piece that goes with this is the imaginative excesses, so let's look at that because that will help actually. These two pieces help explain each other. This is the final aphorism from Minima Moralia that we'll read. Okay, he writes, those schooled in dialectical theory are reluctant to indulge in positive images of the proper society, of its members, even of those who would accomplish it. Past traces deter them. In retrospect, all social utopias since Plato's merge in a dismal resemblance to what they were devised against. The leap into the future, clean over the conditions of the present, lands in the past. In other words, ends and means cannot be formulated in isolation from each other. Dialectics will have no truck with the maxim that the former justify the latter, no matter how close it seems to come to the doctrine of the ruse of reason, or for that matter, the subordination of individual spontaneity to party discipline. The belief that the blind play of means could be summarily displaced by the sovereignty of rational ends was bourgeois utopianism. It is the antithesis of means and ends itself that should be critiqued. Both means and ends are reified in bourgeois thinking. The ends as ideas, the sterility of which lies in their powerlessness to be externalized, such unrealizability being craftily passed off as implicit in absoluteness, means as data of mere meaningless existence to be sorted out according to their effectiveness or lack of it, into anything whatever, but devoid of reason in themselves. So if you recall from Lukács, when we read the phenomenon of reification, he talked about this means-ends reversal. Society is rational in its means, but not in its ends. It's rational in its particular activity, but irrational as a whole. Okay, back to Adorno. This petrified antithesis holds good for the world that produced it, but not for the effort to change it. Solidarity can call on us to subordinate not only individual interests, but even our better insight. Conversely, violence, manipulation, and devious tactics compromise the end they claim to serve, and thereby dwindle to no more than means. Hence the precariousness of any statement about those on whom the transformation depends. Because means and ends are actually divided, the subjects of the breakthrough cannot be thought of as an unmediated unity of the two. No more, however, can the division be perpetuated in theory by the expectation that they might be either simply bearers of the end or else unmitigated means. The dissident, wholly governed by the end, is today, in any case, so thoroughly despised by friend and foe as an idealist and daydreamer, that one is more inclined to impute redemptive powers to his eccentricity than to affirm his impotence as impotent. Certainly, however, no more faith can be placed in those equated with the means, the subjectless beings whom historical wrong has robbed of the strength to right it. Adapted to technology and unemployment, conforming and squalid, hard to distinguish from the windjackets of fascism, their actual state disclaims the idea that puts its trust in them. Both types are theater masks of class society projected onto the night sky of the future, and the bourgeois themselves have always delighted at their errors, no less than their irreconcilability. On the one hand, the abstract rigorist, helplessly striving to realize chimeras, and on the other, the subhuman creature who, as dishonor's progeny, shall never be allowed to avert it. What the rescuers would be like cannot be prophesied without obscuring their image with falsehood. What can be perceived, however, is what they will not be like. Neither personalities nor bundles of reflexes, but least of all a synthesis of the two, hard-boiled realists with a sense of higher things. When the constitution of human beings has grown adapted to social antagonisms heightened to the extreme, the humane constitution sufficient to hold antagonism in check will be mediated by the extremes, not an average mingling of the two. The bearers of technical progress, now still mechanized mechanics, will, in evolving their special abilities, reach the point already indicated by technology where specialization grows superfluous. Once their consciousness has been converted into pure means without any qualification, it may cease to be a means, and breach, with its attachment to particular objects, the last heteronymous barrier, its last entrapment in the existing order, the last fetishism of the status quo, including of its own self, which is dissolved in its radical implementation as an instrument. Drawing breath at last, it may grow aware of the incongruence between its rational development and the irrationality of its ends, and act accordingly. At the same time, however, the producers are more than ever thrown back on theory, to which the idea of a just condition evolves in their own medium, self-consistent thought, by virtue of insistent self-criticism. The class division of society is also maintained by those who oppose class society. Following the schematic division of physical and mental labor, they split themselves up into workers and intellectuals. This division cripples the practice which is called for. It cannot be arbitrarily set aside. But while those professionally concerned with things of the mind are themselves turned more and more into technicians, the growing opacity of capitalist mass society makes an association between intellectuals who still are such, with workers who still know themselves to be such, more timely than 30 years ago. He's referring back to 1917. He's writing in 1947. At that time, such unity was compromised by freewheeling bourgeois of the liberal professions, who were shut out by industry and tried to gain influence by left-wing bustlings. The community of workers of head in hand had a soothing sound, and the proletariat rightly sniffed out, in the spiritual leadership commended to them by figures such as Kurt Hiller, a subterfuge to bring the class struggle under control by just such spiritualization. Today, when the concept of the proletariat, unshaken in its economic essence, is so occluded by technology that in the greatest industrial country there can be no question of proletarian class consciousness, so he's talking about the United States, the role of intellectuals would no longer be to alert the torpid to their most obvious interests, but to strip the veil from the eyes of the wise guys. Not wise guys like gangsters, but wise guys like clever people who think of themselves as smarter. The illusion that capitalism, which makes them its temporary beneficiaries, is based on anything other than their exploitation and oppression. The deluded workers are directly dependent on those who can still just see and tell of their delusion. Their hatred of intellectuals has changed accordingly. It has aligned itself to the prevailing common sense views. The masses no longer mistrust intellectuals because they betray the revolution, but because they might want it, and thereby reveal how great is their own need of intellectuals. Only if the extremes come together will humanity survive. We're going to see in our readings for Thursday that he's going to come back to the separation of theory and practice, which he is discussing here in terms of means and ends and workers and intellectuals. Right, but these categories, like the categories of means and ends, the category of theory and practice, right, bring in the question of philosophy. Again, meaning how has philosophy dealt with the separation of theory and practice, with this estrangement within bourgeois society itself and capitalism. Okay, so I mentioned the ideal and the real. One of the sections of Negative Dialectics that we have in our readings it's finding it in the text. Oops. We had it in our readings for tonight. It's page 146 in the Continuum edition of Negative Dialectics. It's the Dialectics of Identity. All right, so remember that identity, the identity that he's addressing here is the identity of social being and consciousness. It's the identity of the ideal and the real, which was always a speculative identity, meaning it was always this dialectical identity. So it was an identity of what we might call identity and non-identity. So here's a distinction that's important when discussing this concept of identity in philosophy. So identity is not the same thing as entity. So we might mistake identity for entity. Entity is being. So an entity is just something that is. Identity is something that becomes, meaning something attains self-identity. It becomes identical with itself. It doesn't have that self-identity to begin with. And again, the difference between the extant and the actual. So merely what exists is an entity, that which is, whereas identity is something that has to be striven for, aspired to, and achieved. So something becomes identical with itself. So something in its actuality is in its potential that it is tasked with realizing. So identity in that way is it's not merely an entity, but it's best to understand as a self-identity. And it's a self-identity that begins as non-identity, meaning something that merely exists is actually not identical with itself because it hasn't yet realized itself. It hasn't yet fulfilled itself. It hasn't yet realized its potential. Okay, so let's see how he addresses that here. As the thinker immerses himself in what faces him to begin with, in the concept, so the thinker faces not merely what exists, but faces the concept of what exists. And as he perceives its imminently antinomical character, so the fact that it has antithetical laws or rules, that's what antinomy means, or antinomical means. So the concept has this, not merely existence, but our concept of existence has this character, he says. He clings to the idea of something beyond contradiction. The antithesis of thought to whatever is heterogeneous to thought, anything that has a different origin, that's what heterogeneous means, as opposed to homogeneous, meaning from the same source. Heterogeneous means from different sources. Anything that is not from the same source as thought itself is reproduced in thought itself as thought's own immanent contradiction. Reciprocal criticism of the universal and the particular, identifying acts of judgment, whether the concept does justice to what it covers. So how do you measure a concept? Whether it does justice to what it grasps. And whether the particular fulfills its concept, whether something has attained to its own concept. This is actually what Marx was talking about, and also what Lukács was talking about. That labor only attains to its concept in bourgeois society, and in certain respects it only attains to its concept in capitalism, but in a contradictory way, meaning labor as freedom and labor as unfreedom, labor as self-realized activity, self-legislated autonomous activity, but also as heteronymous and dominated. In both senses, labor attains to its concept only in capitalism. Labor per se as freedom, labor per se as unfreedom, simultaneously. So when something attains to its concept, it actually is tasked with overcoming itself, overcoming its own being as well as the concept of its being. That's like the Hegelian approach to these things. Labor attains to its concept only in capitalism because it's become self-contradictory. Money only attains to its concept in capitalism, again because it's become self-contradictory. It's a medium of exchange, but it's also a store of value of capital, and actually contradicts itself in those two different respects, as a medium of exchange versus as a store of value and capital. This is something that Marx addressed in Das Kapital. These this non-identity, constitute the medium of thinking about the non-identity of particular and concept. So the fact that thinking is happening at all means that it's mediating. What is it mediating? It's mediating this contradiction. And the contradiction is showing up to the thinker as the contradiction between the particular thing and the concept of it. And he says not only thinking. If mankind is to get rid of the coercion to which the form of identification really subjects it, the commodity form, it must attain identity with its concept at the same time. Now here's where there's an unfortunate aspect to this translation. So when E.B. Ashton, that's a pseudonym for the translator, by the way, uses the term barter, actually the term is exchange. So he says, in this, all relevant categories play a part. The exchange principle, not the barter principle, the exchange principle, the reduction of human labor to the abstract universal concept of average working hours, is fundamentally akin to the principle of identity. Identification is sort of a little bit of an unfortunate, maybe too literal translation of becoming identical. Exchange is the social model of this principle, and without the principle, there would be no exchange. It is through exchange that non-identical individuals and non-identical performances become commensurable and identical. So this is again the commodity form, the unity of the incommensurable and the commensurable. The making commensurable through exchange value. The spread of the principle imposes on the whole world an obligation to become identical, to become total. But if we denied the principle abstractly, if we proclaimed to the greater glory of the irreducibly qualitative that parity should no longer be the ideal rule, we would be creating excuses for recidivism into ancient injustice. From olden times, the main characteristic of the exchange of equivalents has been that unequal things would be exchanged in its name, but the surplus of labor would be appropriated. If the comparability as a category of measure were simply annulled, the rationality which is inherent in the exchange principle, as ideology of course, but also as promise, would give way to direct appropriation to force, and nowadays to the naked privilege of the monopolies and the cliques, or the rackets, that came up in the Reflections on Class Theory. He says, therefore, when we criticize the exchange principle as the identifying principle of thought, we want to realize the ideal of free and just exchange. To date, this ideal is only a pretext. Its realization alone would transcend exchange. Once critical theory has shown it up for what it is, an exchange of things that are equal yet unequal, our critique of the inequality within equality aims at equality too. For all our skepticism of the rancor involved in the bourgeois egalitarian ideal that tolerates no qualitative difference. If no man had part of his labor withheld from him anymore, rational identity would be a fact, and society would have transcended the identifying mode of thinking. This comes close enough to Hegel. The dividing line from him is scarcely drawn by individual distinctions, it is drawn by our intent, whether in our consciousness, theoretically, and in the resulting practice, we maintain that identity is the ultimate, that it is absolute, that we want to reinforce it, or whether we feel that identity is the universal coercive mechanism which we too finally need to free ourselves from universal coercion, just as freedom can come to be real only through coercive civilization and not by way of any back to nature. Totality is to be opposed by convicting it of non-identity with itself, of the non-identity it denies according to its own concept. Negative dialectics is thus tied to the supreme categories of identitarian philosophy as its point of departure. Thus, too, it remains false according to identitarian logic. It remains the thing against which it is conceived. It must correct itself in its critical course, a course affecting concepts which in negative dialectics are formally treated as if they came first for it too. It is one thing for our thought to close itself under compulsion of the form which nothing can escape from, to comply in principle, so as imminently to deny the conclusive structure claimed by traditional philosophy, and it is quite another thing for thought to urge that conclusive form on its own with the intent of making itself the first. Jump ahead here. Identity is the primal form of ideology. We relish it as adequacy to the thing it suppresses. Adequacy has always been subjection to dominant purposes, and in that sense its own contradiction. After the unspeakable effort it must have cost our species to produce the primacy of identity even against itself, man rejoices and basks in his conquest by turning it into the definition of the conquered thing. What has happened to it must be presented by the thing as it's in itself. Ideology's power of resistance to enlightenment is owed to its complicity with identifying thought, or indeed with the thought at large. The ideological side of thinking shows in its permanent failure to make good on the claim that the non-I is finally the I. The more the I thinks, the more perfectly will it find itself debased into an object. Identity becomes the authority for a doctrine of adjustment in which the object, which the subject is supposed to go by, repays the subject for what the subject has done to it. The subject is to see reason against its reason. The critique of ideology is thus not something peripheral and intrascientific, not something limited to the objective mind and to the products of the subjective mind. Philosophically, it is central. It is a critique of the constitutive consciousness itself. But he's using objective mind here and subjective mind. Mind is Geist. It's the Hegelian Geist. It's spirit. So objective spirit and subjective spirit. So he's saying that we want to, in overcoming capitalism, realize also its ideals, its ideal principles, including that of exchange, of just and equal exchange. The paradox being that it's just an equal exchange that actually reinforces the system as it now is. Okay, I realize I've kept you guys a little bit late. So we will continue tomorrow. We'll continue with our selections from Negative Dialectics. We'll have a little bit less reading, and that means we'll be able to take it at a less condensed and rapid pace than we did tonight. All right, I will look forward to seeing you guys tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Guys.
Thank you.
Bye.